pleasure for us to be here, and also a pleasure for me to introduce the panel. It is Antonio De Lauri, a social anthropologist and a professor at CMI. And you are also leading the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies. And then there's another anthropologist, also Professor Synnøve Bendiksen. You are also the head of the Department of Social Anthropology. And myself, I am Kjersti Berg. I am an associate professor at the NLR University College in Bergen. And I'll be chairing this panel. So the title of the panel, Continental Encampment, is from this book that we published this year. And Antonio and Synnøve both had 2 contributions, articles in chapters in this book. And today we're going to discuss in particular their contributions, their chapters. But before we delve into Lampedusa and the Balkan route, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the term continental encampment and what we mean in the book by humanitarian containment. So also I forgot to mention that this book was edited by John Knudsen and myself, and we have contributions from scholars from Norway, the Middle East, and different European countries. And most of the case studies in the book are from the Middle East, but Synnøve's and Antonio's are from the Balkans and Europe. So continental encampment. So since 2015 and the Syrian refugee crisis, Turkey and Hungary in the lead have erected and reinforced barriers to deter migrants. And from the end of 2016, the EU had restructured its migration management. It had implemented several deep changes. It stepped up its border controls on land and sea routes, and it restructured its migration management, and it entered into several migration agreements with countries to deter migrants, so-called compacts. And this is, of course, not a novel phenomena. We can easily trace it back to the 1990s with the Schengen agreements. But this was a development that really was a response to the Syrian refugee crisis and other migration migrants coming through this same routes. And pre-border control is termed externalization. And this has become the cornerstone of EU migration management ever since. And in this system, the Middle East is seen as a hosting solution to mass migration. So some countries like Lebanon, who have today more than 1 million refugees within its border, refused to set up new camps, but a lot of informal sites have been built, and refugees in Lebanon face severe restrictions in terms of access to labor, mobility, and residency, and they depend on parallel systems for housing, food, and healthcare under, in particular, the UN. So these measures to prevent refugees from leaving their region and to return those who actually leave has made the Middle East, we argue in this book, into a zone of containment, where millions remain displaced indefinitely. And we argue that it differs from previous responses in terms of its wide geographic reach, its magnitude of people interred, and the range of measures used. You have economic, humanitarian, political, and legal measures used to affect this. The implications are, of course, very serious, and we will discuss some implications with Antonio and Synnøve. And we argue that hosting countries have been turned into buffer states. And of course, refugees and migrants are deterred or have no access to seek asylum, and their right to seek asylum is violated. So we argue that this gives the humanitarian containment, or the Continental Encampment, gives the Middle East camp-like features, where in the region mixed groups of free refugees and migrants subsist on humanitarian aid with restrictions on mobility in host states and internationally. And this is an inevitable result of preventing refugees and migrants to reach Europe, and makes, we argue, humanitarian containment a new type of durable solutions to mass migration. And Middle East is not the only part of this system, and we're moving to the Balkan and to Italy to understand now more of the different ways this system works. And we will move to you, Antonio, first. You have your microphone. So what happens in Lampedusa from the moment a boat arrives and onwards?
Yes, thanks. Well, of course, these questions has different answers based on the period we're talking about. So at the moment, what happens is that Lampedusa is one of the hotspots of the European regime apparatus. And what is a hotspot? The hotspot is basically a form of migration management that merges two different aspects of the migration regime. One is the humanitarian apparatus, and the other one is basically the securitizing dimension of this regime. And the hotspot is compared to other forms of migration management of the past, like Mare Nostrum, Triton, and so on. The hotspot idea is the one that more explicitly merges these two dimensions. Like the good side, we are helping; bad side, we are rejecting and stopping on the border. So what happens now is that as soon as a boat arrives, the migrants are taken to the hotspot center in the middle of the island. And there is a complete alienation of the local population in Lampedusa. So they are taken there for a period of time that is not easy to determine at the beginning. It could be a few days, it could be a couple of months. The large majority of the migrants who are coming from North Africa and the Sub-Saharan Africa are rejected. Especially Tunisians are immediately rejected. Some of them had tried the trip several times, and each time with the same sort of destiny, because they are sent back to Tunisia. This, as I said, is kind of what happens now. Before, it was different. So Lampedusa started to be a kind of important point of passage through Europe in the 90s. At the beginning, the few boats that used to land in Lampedusa, they were basically welcomed by the local population, who would give blankets and something to drink to the migrants, and then sometimes paying the tickets to them to reach Sicily. Then over time, there has been a bureaucratization of this apparatus, And of course, this changed also with the regional changes, the situation in Libya and so on. One crucial moment was when the guard coast, basically the military patrolling the borders, started to search for migrants, not close to the coast, but 100 miles away from the coast. Basically, it was a part of an attempt to securitize the regime by bringing in migrants and sending back, you know, because this was part of a business that was also bringing a lot of money to European borders apparatuses. And then this kind of phase came together with the alienation of the local population that gradually were taken out of the welcoming practices, to the point that nowadays it is not allowed to go to the harbor when a boat arrives. And this, of course, creates this different kind of also sentiments on the island. Fishermen from Lampedusa, when they go out, for example, they are very afraid and very concerned that they can meet a boat or even corpses in the sea, because if that happens, their boat is confiscated, they can't work for years. So there are a lot of rituals, praise that local population have in order to avoid not to be involved in that kind of situation, because it would be extremely difficult for them to handle. And on the other side, it's the hotspot has become a place where you cannot enter. So, for example, it's the only off-limit space in Lampedusa. When I went there, I was able to visit every houses and places, but not the hotspot center, which is gated. But the migrants can anyway go out and they try to spend their day in the city center. So yeah, this is more or less the situation nowadays, and then we
can. Thank you. So how is Lampedusa part of, and the hotspot, part of a larger migration management system?
Yeah. So first of all, why I went to Lampedusa is because I wanted to understand one important thing that to me was very concerning. So the fact that Lampedusa is very well known, not only in academic circles, but also in the media. So, we talk a lot about, tragedies on the borders in the Mediterranean. There are artists, activists, NGOs, researchers, journalists who go, regularly to Lampedusa to witness what's going on. There are many humanitarian actors who help in the search and rescue operations. So this is something that is well known, and is something that is often discussed. And so my concern was, why then nothing changes? Why nothing happens? No? So that was the question I wanted to, in a way, to address by doing research there. And to me, part of the answer is that, and then I get to the hotspot idea. Part of the answer is that there has been this creation of a humanitarian framework of the tragedy that allows people to understand, this tragedy as part of a natural, like a destiny, a sort of bad luck of those who try to go through Lampedusa to reach Europe. And yet there is this humanitarian apparatus who tries to help, who tries to do what's possible. And there is this always idea of a crisis, emergency. So on one side, mobility has been transformed in a constant idea of crisis. So whenever there is mobility, there is crisis, emergency. And on the other side, there is Europe that reacts with the humanitarian means. So this idea, in a way, creates a sort of neutrality of mobility, of the management of mobility, that doesn't, for example, allow often to talk about the political responsibilities of the death at sea. So it's much easier to address the crisis, this supposed crisis, in terms of humanitarian means, rather than, for example, legal rights or political responsibilities. And so the idea that I think is important there is to detach, to separate this narration, this language of crisis, emergency, and humanitarianism from the idea of mobility. So that is where, for example, the hotspot becomes particularly important as a case study, because the hotspot is, as I said before, the kind of the emblem of this idea of merging securitization and humanitarian aid. And that's why also in the chapter I talk about the spectacle of the hotspot in Lampedusa. And when we talk about spectacle, we have to understand, so who is the audience? And the audience of that spectacle are European societies, that they watch this constant crisis going on, and they develop the idea of there is something, emergent, something urgent, something bad that is happening on the borders, especially at sea. So we must react with these emergency means that are humanitarian means, that they're never allowed to look for durable solutions, legal solutions, and so on. The reality is different, because the large majority of those who are labeled as illegal migrants in Europe, they overstay their visa. So there are normal people who arrive with a visa and they overstay. This is by far the large majority of illegal migrants. Those who cross the sea illegally is a very small minority. And the large majority, I think around 80%, are rejected. So they are deported. So the spectacle then creates also a fake image of what's going on across the borders. And then there is also a big difference between the use of the violence on the border, for example, in the Mediterranean, than, for example, in the Balkans. Whereas in the Balkans, there is a direct use of violence by police, for example, beating up, jailing for days, and so on. In the Mediterranean, when you cross the sea or a desert, for what matters, the use of violence, it's easier, because you don't even need to use direct violence, but inaction is enough. And rescue operations are very difficult, so delaying rescue operations can mean the death of many. So there is this then kind of violence that is implemented on the borders of Southern Europe that sometimes becomes the same thing as the humanitarian approach. So the idea of deresponsibilizing states by giving the responsibility of the rescue operation to humanitarian actors, delaying the possibility to reach a harbor, and so on. So there is this kind of violence that migrants face that is sometimes difficult even for them to understand, because there is not one person directly to complain against, to claim as responsible. So it's a form of structural violence that affects, of course, the whole journey of migrants, especially those who try, many times.
You made a bridge to the Balkan case, Antonio, with arguing that the violence is more outright, and then I'm wondering if you, Synnøve, can start by describing the Balkan route from the refugees' perspective.
Yeah, sure. So what we know as the Balkan route has a long history, but it has changed over time. And it was declared so-called closed, so officially closed by the EU in 2016 as a consequence of the EU-Turkey agreement. But of course, it was not closed. A lot of refugees and other migrants are using that route. And actually this year, it is the second most used route. So whereas there's 22,000 what Frontex define as illegal border crossings in that region of the Balkan, you'll have 42,000. This is the numbers this year from January to April from Frontex. So 42,000 crossing the Mediterranean border. Those crossing the border in Balkan are coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, North Africa, and most of them are going through Turkey because many of them some of them are not having a visa, but a group from North Africa, they can have a visa in Turkey. So they can fly to Turkey and then they continue their route over to Greece. Very often they are fearing in Greece that they will be caught by the police and stopped. So this is one of the another internal bordering structures that we see. And then if they're not stopped, they continue to North Macedonia, walk across the country for 4 days, walking, and go over either to Serbia, Romania, or Bulgaria. The problem is that many of them then are stuck either in Serbia or Bosnia-Herzegovina. And they're trying to cross the border up to Croatia, to Hungary, because they want to go to they are in Europe. So we're talking about this Europe, they are in Europe, but it's not the place where they see a future for various reasons. It doesn't have a very good infrastructure to apply for asylum in these countries. There's not a lot of refugees who are accepted if they do apply. And they're not incentivized to do so. They are really incentivized to move on, just continue moving on. And in Serbia and Bosnia, they have spent a lot of money by that time. So their resources are low. So sometimes they have to wait there for their family. So the kinship relationships are really important at home. Family trying to collect more money to send them so that they can continue. They're also tired, been walking for a long time, so they're tired, and sometimes they have to also get a new mobile phone, a new sleeping bag. They have to wait for the weather. They have to know when is a good time to cross the border. They have to find a helper or smuggler, depending on how you will define them, who will bring them to cross the next border. So one of the first phrases I learned in the Balkan was going on the game. And going on the game means crossing the next border, either alone with the help of an app on your phone, or with a smuggler or a helper, or in a group. And many of the people I met had tried 40 times, anything between 2 to 40 times to cross that border, going back and forth. And as Antonio was talking about, the violence at those borders are tremendous and is very visible in the streets of Sarajevo. You will see people with head bandages, with broken arms, with swollen feet, meaning that they have returned for an unsuccessful going on the game. So it's a lot of physical and visible violence that has become almost normalized as part of that process. Yeah, and I just want to mention also in terms of the infrastructure, so there are camps where they can stay. They are either attended to by the IOM, International Organization of Migration, or by the government. But especially in Serbia, they have placed their camps on the wrong side of the border towards Romania. So it's a direction where the migrants and the refugees don't want to go. So they very often say, why should I go down there to rest? Because it's the wrong direction. I'm going upwards. I'm going towards Croatia and towards Hungary. So there's a lot of makeshift camps. There's a lot of mattresses under the bridge. There's tents and squats in empty buildings or in parks or like more forest. Yeah, I can go on and on. Maybe I can just I just want to add one thing about the violence. It's also important to remember that this is an area which had a war in 1990s. There's a lot of mines still, and the mines are situated where the refugees and other migrants are trying to cross. So that actually what you will see in the official camps, you will see huge maps of where there's mine infected. And they actually also created some years ago an app that they could download on their phone to try to avoid those mines when they're crossing.
Thank you. So Antonio and Synnøve, both of you. So if you would sort of point out the differences between Lampedusa and the Balkan route. In your chapter, Antonio, you write about the spectacle or the theatralization and the enormous amount of news interest and that has Lampedusa has attracted. Well, so I'm wondering if you could both speak to this sort of as a researcher. How is it, you know, what differs these sites as sites of research, but also as sites of externalization of parts of European migration management?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's important to remember that many of the Balkan states are not part of the EU, but they're incentivized to become a part of the EU. And so they are kind of Serbia and BiH, so Bosnia, are third countries who are motivated to assist the EU in keeping refugees and migrants out of the EU territory, so as a third national. So they kind of also they have to do it as part of the EU continuation of negotiation talks. And they're also incentivized to do so because of the technological assistance they will get, visa-free travels for their own citizens, and economic funding. So that's an important incentivizing of them trying to stop the border. So whereas migrants or refugees and other migrants are looking at it as a transit, these Bosnia and Serbia are incentivized to, this should not be a transit, you should stop and hinder them to continue to the EU. At the same time, though, the national government in Serbia and in Bosnia, they also a bit ambiguous about this because they don't have a very well functioning asylum system. They don't have a reception system and ideas of what should we do with asylum seekers in the countries, and they have, especially Bosnia, huge high unemployment. So it's a lot of economic difficulties also in future of integrating and including them. And the population in general, what I've heard is also a bit worried. So the government is trying to show to its population they are just traversing. This is a transit country, but at the same time, they have to show EU, we are stopping them. So this is why I'm calling this a labyrinthian effect. So it really becomes a labyrinthian architecture for the migrants, which they are allowed to take the bus and they're allowed to cross the territory legally, but then at the same time, they're stopped suddenly inside the border, inside the country. So it actually also shows how borders are not only at the territory, but it also happens within the country.
Yeah, no, I think that a comparison between Lampedusa and the Balkans is useful because it shows that these two apparently different approaches, for instance, you know, the direct silencing of the violence, of the physical violence in the Balkans, and you know, the spectacle of the border in Lampedusa, they are part of the same logic. So which is hindering you know, migration towards Europe, which then can take in very different ways. And it is important to understand what takes this kind of different approaches together. And one is this, you know, humanitarian language. That's why I think it's important, because sometimes we talk about, you know, what contribution can you have, and language is important. So the idea of, you know, starting to politically separate the notions of crisis, emergency, and humanitarianism from, you know, the rights to move, it's very important. Because then we understand that it is not within the logic of emergency that we can approach, you know, mobility, but through the logic of legal rights, human rights, and so on. And it's different when you act within the idea of emergency. Everything is justified, right? So that's a big difference. And this is what I learned, for example, looking at the humanitarian system in other contexts, for example, Afghanistan, where I did most of my research. So in the humanitarian context, everything becomes possible. Things that are not allowed to imagine in a context of, you know, normal, ordinary politics. So this is very important because of that. Then you alluded to the role of researchers. For example, doing research in Lampedusa, which is, so Italy is my country, of course, has it has some ethical, for example, challenges for me, but more broadly, the challenges of researchers working on migration issues in Europe, it's quite problematic. It's difficult to address, because agencies, funding agencies like the European Commission, they fund both research to understand what's going on along the borders and how to help migrants, but also research on how to make the borders more secure. The very same agencies, when you have when there are call for applications of Horizon projects that explicitly ask to involve Frontex. So when you have this kind of ethical dilemmas, it's not easy then to find the right positionality and to understand what's your role in this logic, right? As I said, everybody's talking about Lampedusa, so you go there and you have the feeling, there's something wrong. I'm here like all the others, and I'm part of this. So it's there are ethical dilemmas that are important to address and not easy.
I'm just preparing you to be ready with questions. We have 12 minutes left, and yeah. So if anyone has any questions, please, you're most welcome to come ask. Oh, we have a good line already. That's fantastic. So Bjarte, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for your presentations. The population in the Middle East, Africa, south of Sahara is increasing and probably will continue to do so. So these problems will not disappear with the climate change and so on. So what to do? What do you propose that European Union should we uphold the legal framework we have, give support to the countries, establish more centers for asylum seeking, so on? Is that, so to say, the simple solution to it? And also on a broader range, what to do with the regimes and the situation in the Middle East? Thanks.
Hi, my name's Heinz Klug from the University of Wisconsin and University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So I started out as a refugee in 1979. And I'm interested because the refugee system, of course, came out of the Second World War and Europe. And so what is that system now dead? Right? There was mention in the discussion about asylum. And yet we're really talking about mobility, and maybe that's the better way to talk about it, about the need for human mobility across borders. And the asylum issue really becomes, because the way it was individualized, although the way it was dealt with in practice after the Second World War was not individualized. It was the understanding that of mass movements of people. And yet now it's been individualized to the point where it's nearly impossible to be an asylee, to be a refugee. So what does it mean for the refugee system globally? Should we be challenging that system and saying it really doesn't exist anymore? And it's really about mobility and the ability of humans to move. Thank you.
Me dijeron que Antonio puede llegar a entender español, ¿es cierto? Okay. Entonces la formulo en español y Thalía irá traduciendo. Dentro del movimiento de mujeres indígenas y diversidades en Argentina, estamos interpelando la categoría de migrantes. Creemos que es una mala palabra y que viene a fortalecer el reconocimiento de la geopolítica de los Estados-nación y sus fronteras. Nosotras creemos que había una cosmografía y esa palabra migrante la sustituimos por transhumante, que es un derecho inherente a los humanos. Mi pregunta, Antonio, es si queremos darle la carga política de responsabilidad a esta fortificación de las fronteras, ¿cuál sería el neologismo correcto? ¿Cuál sería la nomenclatura que deberíamos empezar a usar para emplazar esos derechos? Thalía traduce.
Within the indigenous movement in women indigenous movement in Argentina, we are challenging the category of migrant because we believe that that does not represent how the cosmology within which humans mobilize around the world. So we've come up with a new term, which is the transhuman. We believe this is a right. So my question for you today is how we come up with a new concept, a new term by which we can be aid in spotting a light on how this depoliticization of the migration crisis is affecting the response of the states and their responsibility being carried out through this idea that mentioned in your presentation of the humanitarian approach.
And my question is also for Antonio. You've talked about the situation paradoxically not changing in Lampedusa with permanent solutions. Do you think that the situation will change with the current government, since immigration is one of the main points around which Georgia and her colleagues have collected their consensus and votes? And if the answer is yes, in which direction do you think this solution will be articulated?
Hello, my name is Samah Khalafallah, University of Bayreuth, Germany. I greatly appreciated the insightful presentation on your chapters. Could you delve deeper into the refugees' personal perspectives, especially on the racism perspective? Additionally, I'm interested in understanding how women and those who identify as women confront and navigate these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you for all these great questions. So I think we're giving the word to Antonio, to Synnøve first, because you have to leave before the session is over.
Yes, I actually have to leave because I have welcoming the new bachelor students in 5 minutes. So I need to be there and say welcome. So let me just say a few things to some of these issues. The first question, what to do politically or how to deal with this. And I know that Antonio will have a different answer to this, so I'll leave that to him. I think one way is to avoid talking about mobility of people as a threat. Right, so the way that externalization of EU is working is really also giving the signal to countries such as Mali, Nigeria, and other countries that you don't want to have people on the move, migrants, refugees, transhuman, whatever you call them. This is nothing that is desirable. So by creating all these incentives and treaties and carrots and whatnot, to avoid people moving, you're also creating the image of danger of these are people who are not with resources and they will just take resources from you. So I think changing that way of how we're talking about it is the first thing one should do. I also want to talk about the women. The last question about women along the Balkan route. So most of the people across the Balkan route are young men, and they're young single men, but you also see families. You don't very often see women alone. They would, most of the time, what researchers say is that they will either go with their family or they will find someone who will stand in for them as a family. Right, so kinship is very flexible. Someone can become your uncle or your cousin or your brother, your husband even on the trip. What is true is the violence which is done to those women on the move. It's tremendous and it's in a different sexual way, although you can also see sexual violence along the route. So in Bosnia, there was one smaller NGO where some of the volunteers were charged for sexual harassment towards young male refugees on the move who are in a vulnerable situation, in need of hospitality, humanitarian assistance, and then things can happen. Things do happen. I just want to say about the, actually before I leave, I maybe instead of answering properly your question, I would like to explain why I try to use the term refugee and other migrants. And that is because UNHCR uses refugees for people fleeing war or persecution across international borders, while the term migrant usually is used to cover people moving for reasons not included in that legal definition. However, we also have to recognize that people on the move are not always clear-cut why they are moving. So migrants may also have experiences along the route which gives them the right to qualify for asylum. And refugees might not be considered or given asylum when they are applying for such. So this is why researchers also have come to recognize that the distinction between willing to move and being forced to move is not very clear-cut. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So that is why many researchers now are using refugees and other migrants, which is a broader term that recognizes that it also included refugees. And very often for migrant scholars such as myself, the reason for why people are on the move is not the main point of the research, is really understanding the movement, the mobility. And then it becomes a broader political question, whereas the term refugee, which was also asked by one of the participants here, is no longer useful because of the legal rights that are not there to cover them. And one can ask, is the legal apparatus there, but it's just interpreted and used not in a very correct way, or not how it was intended to do? I know that in Norway, for example, we did have individual right before 2010, and then it turned over to, group rights, and then it turned over to be an individual right after that. So it is very often a political question how these legislations are interpreted, unfortunately. Okay, I'm going to leave the rest to Antonio. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm so sorry I have to leave.
So yes, I will try to be quick because we are over time. So the refugee regime, well, first of all, I don't think the refugee regime applies the same way everywhere in the world. So I think that's the distinction that we first have to make, right? So it's not generalizable what we could say about the effect of the refugee regime today. If we look, for example, at the outcome of the war in Ukraine and the way the refugees have been welcomed and the way European states have reacted, that could be considered a very positive, outcome of the refugee convention and regime. But it doesn't apply the same for others. So of course there are racial issues behind it, geopolitical. So the fact is that the refugee regime globally is heavily affected by political interests, racial understandings that we sometimes struggle to recognize openly. But other refugees they see firsthand. I was contacted a couple of months ago by an Afghan family in Germany who told me they were relocated suddenly because the place where they have been for almost 2 years was given to Ukrainian refugees. So there are differences, right? So that is something we have to recognize. Muchas gracias por su pregunta. Es muy importante. So, scholars very often come out with new words, but most of the time they are ineffective. So I think there is an important distinction to be made between social movements, activists advancing new ideas and including new languages, and scholars doing that. So when is So I think that is the job of a social movement, basically. As a scholar, I think our job is to shed doubts, to say, I don't think this language is appropriate. I think this language is creating more damages, which is, for example, the case of the humanitarian language across the borders. So, and understanding the critique of crisis, for example, as a critique of language in Europe, the language that we use to understand mobility, migration, and so on. So I think there is a very good synergy that can be developed between social movements developing and advancing new ways of understanding reality, and scholars doing their work in terms of, raising doubts. So that is a good balance to me. And the last question was Giorgia Meloni. I think I'm recorded. So Giorgia Meloni, Ellie Schlein, we can talk over lunch when I'm not on video. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for contributing to the session and for your attention. So, and thank you also for inviting us to Berg and Exchanges.
Thank you so much.